I'll give it to you later as a Zoom recording. Okay, so to the basics. We're going to start this discussion of electricity on Shabbat and Yom Tov. And the first question that I asked as an introduction is, how can we picture our life in general without electricity? And it's important because we can decide when we want what devices we want to use on Shabbat or not, but that is not something that, this is something that is applicable outside Eretz Israel, but in Israel, the power company and the workers there are all Jewish. So now there is a problem for people who live in Israel to benefit from the power grid on Shabbat, especially if there's a blackout, like some people are witnessing right now and are without electricity. If there's a blackout and then the power is restored on Shabbat, then we have to assume that the Jewish workers in the power plant, worked on Shabbat to restore that. So now you are enjoying that electricity that has been produced on Shabbat, maybe in a forbidden way. And yes, people are commenting that they don't have to imagine it because they lived with Yoshua in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. When I lived in Bogota, we had 1 year where they were rolling blackouts because there was shortage of energy, and as a result, we had only 3 hours of electricity on in the morning and in the evening. The rest of the day was no electricity. People got generators. Some people just go early to bed. But one of the cute stories was one of my friends who he lived in a fourth or fifth floor, and every time he would get home, he would complain to the portero, to the doorman, that there's no electricity. He goes up and down all the stairs. The only day that the building had electricity was on Shabbat, and on that day he took the stairs also. So the doorman thought it's completely crazy. So I want to keep in mind this question: how do we get along without electricity? And do we have, as observant people, do we have moments during Shabbat or Yom Tov where we say, "Oh, I wish I could use electricity"? Ever happened to you when you say, "I wish I could have done that"? Or you say, "No, I don't feel the need at all"? Okay, so to different people, different situations. We ask that. Also to consider that when we talk about this prohibition as an all-encompassing prohibition, but it has many, because of what I mentioned before, how do we manage without electricity? It has many different applications. The way it is, it manifests itself. It's different for us at home when we set everything from before Shabbat. The AC is on a certain, is set up. Our devices are on timers whether we need them or not, light, etc. But what about emergency services? In Israel, for example, the army. What about hospitals? What about not only directly what is directly involving pikuach nefesh, but also things that are in a secondary way could cause pikuach nefesh. Such, for example, if we take a hospital, for example, in Israel, you have non-Jewish staff that walks around with the doctors to take notes in a permissible way for them. Meanwhile, there's all this delay between the doctor and the staff. We could argue that over time there will be enough loss of time accumulated that could affect the life of a person. So that's an important thing to have in mind. But when we get to Eretz Israel, as I said, is a special problem. And here, before we go into the halachot, let us consider that. What are the arguments? What are the halachic arguments against using electricity on Yom Tov and on Shabbat? When you search for arguments that are based in halacha, what are these arguments? So we have two things. We have two main things here. One that Yosef already mentioned, which is the spirit of Shabbat. Yes, Isaac?
No, fine.
No, fine. So one is the concept of the spirit of Shabbat. That is a very vague concept. and is used widely by the rabbis to forbid many different activities. But when you think of the spirit of Shabbat, it is multifaceted. Meaning, I could argue, for example, that people who go to shul and spend 4 hours in the morning away from their families, and then when they go home, maybe on Friday night, like in the Hasidic communities, go to a tish with the Rebbe, also leaving their families home, are not acting in the spirit of Shabbat. The spirit of Shabbat is a very, as I said, very nebulous concept. How do you exactly define it? Is it uh, based on how society in your area? It's subjective in your area, at your time, in your region. What is it exactly? So we could say that it's more a conceptual idea that belongs to Shabbat. But when we go to the halachot of Shabbat, we like to usually rely on the list of 39 melachot, right? The famous list of the 39 melachot of Shabbat. The problem is that when you go through the melachot of Shabbat, the 39 melachot, none of them could really apply to using electricity. The first 11 melachot are all about making bread or baking. So it's not about using electricity. It's about the result. So on that, everybody would agree that anything that has to do with cooking or preparing food, if you do it by any means, whether it's electricity or other means, that will be forbidden because it's part of those melachot Shabbat. The next 13 melachot deal with preparing wool, harvesting, etc. Sorry, not harvesting, sharing, dyeing the wool, weaving, etc. And another 9 melachot that deal with preparation of leather, slaughtering, skinning an animal, processing the leather, writing, etc. And then we have 6 extra melachot that are sort of like miscellaneous. Aboneh v'asoter, amchabev, amav'ir, amakeh v'patish. So we have the prohibition on construction, destruction, or taking apart, starting a fire, putting out a fire, and makeh v'patish, which is the final blow that completes an instrument or an object for use. Now, the problem that we have when we look at the list of the 39 melachot is that though we argue that it is eternal, the people argue that it's an eternal halacha, nothing there could reflect the technology and the situations that we face today. So what the rabbis would argue, no, we are looking for analogies, and I would look for something that bears similarity to what we had in the past to apply to what we have today. And which I agree with, this is something that we would like to look at, but just have in mind that this is in a way is a bit hypocritical, because when we deal with other questions of technology, we don't file them under that rubric of the past. For example, what we just did, we had a virtual minyan. We prayed together and we said Kaddish and Kedusha, right? Why? Because we said the laws that were written 1,200 years ago or 2,000 years ago apply today in the same manner. And if 2,000 years ago the rabbi said that in order to have a minyan, you have to have 10 people in the same room, we apply it today because we understand that being in a virtual room is being together. But I would say the traditional mindset of halacha says, no, we decided that we would make an analogy between melachot that are mentioned in the Mishnah, the 39 melachot, and the electricity as we have it today, but now between the laws of tefillah, as mentioned in the Talmud, to the technology that we have today. So just have this in mind. And we're going to go through the 39 melachot, but I'm going to start with something which is...
Rabbi, sorry, just one point of clarification. Can you define the we? When you say we, which rabbinic, I guess, generation decided this?
I'm not talking about any rabbinic organization, or denomination, or anything like that. We the people. Right now, it's we the people. Like we look at it. If we talk about people who observe Shabbat and care about the use of electricity, whether they use it or not, and they think about where does this come from. So it's speaking about a vague term. I don't want to go now into the the exact nature, because that will do when we look at the the articles and the text that I'm going to pull up, of how exactly it evolved, what happened with electricity, and why is it forbidden on Yom Tov and on Shabbat. And I'm going to start with Yom Tov, even though the basis is Shabbat. I'm going to start with Yom Tov, because it's easier for people to digest the idea of electricity on Yom Tov. One, second, because we have this argument when you come to Yom Tov, and that was brought up when when we were talking about people, not people in general. We're talking about doing seder with Zoom, right? So one of the popular arguments of the Orthodox community, and I will say it's the Orthodox community, was if you allow Zoom on Yom Tov, people will argue, or people will end up using Zoom on Shabbat. Or if you allow and therefore if you allow electricity on Yom Tov, people will also allow electricity on Shabbat. So to that we have to say two things. One, why? Why would people think that if you could use electricity on Yom Tov, you could use electricity on Shabbat? The Orthodox community, observant people, have been for thousands of years have been familiar with the idea that you're allowed to cook on Yom Tov, right? On Yom Tov, you could make food, you could cook, even though you use an existing fire, but you could make food from scratch. From nothing, you could make food, right? The whole thing, soup, stew, whatever you want. Keep the lambrajin, gefilte fish, you name it, you can make it on Yom Tov. But no one ever thought within the observant community to say, hey, I could cook on Yom Tov, so why not cook on Shabbat? So this argument of if you allow them to do this, they would do that, is ridiculous, because we don't give credit to the people, and we don't bother explaining to people what are the parameters of the prohibition, where do we come from. So this is the other thing is that it's the flip side of this argument that I just mentioned. What I just mentioned is the argument that not necessarily if they do this, they will do that, because they know the difference. The other argument is, you say, if they do this, they'll do that. But you have to prove to me that that is also forbidden. Right? You come from the assumption, if you will tell them that this is allowed, they will say that is allowed. But in that argument, already contained is that you decided that, which means the usage of Shabbat, of electricity on Shabbat, is forbidden. And what is the proof for that? So we could say that it's sort of a circular argument. First, we decided that electricity on Shabbat is forbidden, and then we say don't use it on Yom Tov because you'll end up using it on Shabbat.
Rabbi.
Yes.
I think also it's a matter of fear of losing control of people.
Yes. Yes. All the talk about Spirit of Shabbat really falls under this category of control. Why? Because the Spirit of Shabbat should be, as like Yoshua mentioned, it's a subjective thing. It's how we feel about Shabbat, and not how the establishment decides for us what Shabbat is. And 1 second, Netanel, but I'll give you an example. Exercising, jogging, running on Shabbat, the establishment doesn't see it favorably. Why? Because most rabbis, for them, this is not the activity that you do on Shabbat. For them, it's not the spirit of Shabbat. But for many people who are not rabbis, who are not those who write halakha, for them, this is exactly the spirit of Shabbat. This is what they like to do. They like to go with the family, go to the outdoors, bike, run. That's fun for them. But the rabbis come from a different mentality. So we have to consider that. So, but of course, the question has been raised.
But Rabbi,
I've heard this question before. If you say that it is subjective, what are the boundaries of subjectivity? But it's exactly the question that we cannot ask, because there are no boundaries to subjectivity. That means when I say that the Spirit of Shabbat is subjective, it means that we are going, as a community, we are going to decide that in our institutions, electricity here is also flickering. I'm telling you, force majeure, something from above is above here. So I want to say this. People talk about those boundaries of subjectivity. Then some people say, oh, I feel it's okay to go watch a movie on Shabbat, or I feel it's okay to, to excavate with my little bulldozer around the house on Shabbat and put the foundations for a new unit that I'm going to put up. Yes, people might say that, but the thing is that when the establishment tries to define from above for every individual what is it that they're going to do, the spirit of Shabbat deteriorates because people feel that they are forced to do things. Now, if you have to let go of, we have to let go of this will of controlling and defining everything, and look at a large community. Let's say take 100,000 people who observe Shabbat, and they're not going to be the same. People are going to choose different things to what and how to, and they could differ tremendously from one end to another. But if what they share in common is their excitement about Shabbat, meaning that they, when they go and do whatever activity they do on Shabbat, they tell their children, you know why we do it today? Because today is Shabbat and it's the most beautiful day in the world, and we love Shabbat and we can't wait for Shabbat to come, and we're upset when Shabbat is over, right? So maybe they're not doing the right thing, but their children and the grandchildren will have a special affinity for Shabbat, and they will search for how Shabbat will work for them. So at the end result, from those 100,000 people, the majority of their descendants and those related to them will be interested in keeping Shabbat. But what we have today is the opposite. Out of the Jewish people, 85% don't define themselves as Shabbat observant. Why? Because they've been slowly pushed away from the spirit of Shabbat, from that facet of what Shabbat could give you in beauty and joy. Nathaniel, you had a question, and I think Isaac also. Yes.
Yep. I had a quick question about the spirit of Shabbat. So if you assume that electricity is breaking the malachot, that's one thing. That's another discussion. But if you entertain the thought that electricity is not, but it goes against the spirit of Shabbat, what about if you're engaging in or using electricity in the pursuit of learning, or like, for example, like on YouTube, or listening to Spreaker or something like this?
Good point. So we are here, like I said, it's subjective. Some people say that any usage of Shabbat is against the spirit of Shabbat, and other people say no. If it works for you, it works, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. Okay, Yosef, you had a question? Or Isaac, who wanted to talk? Let's see. Yosef.
Okay. Yeah, but if Isaac's in front of me, that's okay. He can go first.
No, I don't see who else. Daniel, I got. Okay, no.
Rabbi, can you hear me?
Yes, Daniel. Yes.
Yeah, I'm Daniel.
So good point. So the word Ruach HaShabbat, it doesn't appear. It doesn't appear anywhere. But what we talk about Oneg Shabbat, based on Yeshayahu Nhed Vekarat Ala Shabbat Oneg. And the rabbis, in their explanation of the pasuk, they say shelo yeh luchacha shel Shabbat ki luchacha shel chol. Don't walk on Shabbat the way you walk on Yom Chol. Don't talk on Shabbat the way you talk on Yom Chol. But the question of how does it apply to each individual, right? When you say, for example, let's take this. This is a nice example. Don't walk on Shabbat the way you walk on Yom Chol, right? So the establishment says jogging on Shabbat is wrong because it's a weekday activity. But if someone who every day is boxed in the office and cannot go anywhere, and Shabbat for him is the only day that he can go out jogging, right? That's his hiluch of Shabbat is not like the hiluch of Chol. He drew the difference. He made the distinction. Anyway, I want to get 1 second. And
but Rabbi.
Yes.
The Talmud specifically discusses Na'ar Sheratz.
No, they speak about it. The halakha speaks about.
You're allowed.
Yeah. The halakha speaks about Na'arim shemit'angim b'mrutzatam. Right?
Yeah.
They say young people who enjoy running and jogging and jumping are allowed to do that. Similarly,
there you go.
Right. And similarly, halakha speaks of people who enjoy hearing the news. This is in the 1400s. I mean, it's not the news as we have them today. They say, Sipurei melachim u'milchamotam. People who enjoy hearing the latest stories of the kings and their campaigns and their wars, they're allowed to discuss it on Shabbat. In other words, the halakha recognized different needs for different people. But today, it's not like that. Everything is already, catalogize and define of what you're allowed to do and not allowed to do. And we didn't even get to the actual text. We're just in the introduction. Nachman, yes.
Rabbi, one question for you. When you first presented this issue, I looked into it and I completely agree with you from a halachic perspective. And I challenged many other Orthodox rabbi. There was only one response, only one, that I found to be extremely persuasive. And the response was, policy is part of halacha. So there is halacha, which is all the categories, the 39 categories you mentioned, and the ones that I think you're going to do an excellent job rebutting or rebutting. But a critical part of halacha is policy. It's not only the law, but it's policy. So both policy and law. So for example, we don't allow blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. Why? You could blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. There's no halachic prohibition because there's a policy concern.
Did he mention this example, or you are using?
No,
it?
he mentioned it. He mentioned it.
Okay, good. Let's stop here. It's a good point, David. Let me hear Nahman's question, and I'll address both. It's an important discussion. Yes, Nahman.
About the Spirit of Shabbat is like a double sword, because I'm gonna make an example. Let's say when you finish davening in shul, everybody walk into the house, and you walk to the house, and you pass to the house that the lights turn on automatically. You don't know that the light is there, and when you pass, the light turn on, and everybody that's walking with you look at you and like you are the worst sinner on earth, because you walk. So you prefer to make somebody feel like it's the worst sinner on the earth, then
right,
make something joyful on Shabbat. It's a problem also we having.
Right. So that we'll talk about it also. That sometimes and I know of someone in my congregation that for many years avoided going through a certain shortcut that he had for his house because of the automatic, of the sensor motion, the motion sensors. And when I told him that, he was so upset that the rabbis who told him that it's forbidden, that for years he had to suffer through this. But I want to answer it. David, what you said is a great example to the sorry to say that, but to the false argument of analogy. Not you, what the rabbi told you. First of all, the rabbi whoever told you that has no real basis to speak about policy, right? Because when you talk about policy, if we want to refer it to what we call takanot, the regulations that were established by the rabbis, everybody agrees that the last generation where you could do takanot that apply to the whole nation was maybe the 5th or 6th century, the end of the Talmudic period. After that, Maimonides says very clearly in his introduction, each rabbinic court in every community has the right to establish rules for its community. There's no worldwide policy. Judaism does not have the Vatican, does not have the Holy See that could issue regulations for all. But the bigger problem is the analogy that he gave you, because he says we have a policy of not blowing shofar on Shabbat. So that is giving you, an analogy that we don't allow the use of electricity. We don't allow the use of shofar on Shabbat. Historically, it's incorrect because up until the 12th century, and at the Bet Din of Rabbi Yitzhak al-Fasi in North Africa and in Spain, he blew shofar on Shabbat. And if you really want to go back, all the way back to the issue of why shofar is not blown on Shabbat, the real reason is not the problem of carrying the shofar, because they were able to bypass it. Some people say you can't carry shofar on Shabbat, so they changed the shofar to the teva to make sure that nobody carries the shofar. The real reason was that after the destruction of the temple, when they moved from Yerushalayim to Yavne, there was a fear, and it's a fear of control, of losing control, that the centrality of the temple in Yerushalayim is going to be lost. So they said, we're not going to blow shofar in another country, in another city, until we go back to Yerushalayim. Had they known that we're going to be away for 2,000 years, would we be in this ridiculous situations where today, where when Shabbat falls on when the first day on Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbat, we don't blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah. We blow shofar on the second day, which is really Bet of Tishrei. But the idea of a policy here is really an idea, I would say, of the last 150, 200 years, but really more of the 20th century. I would even say post-World War II, where the rabbis decided that they're going to take control and create this kind of global Orthodox organization. I'll give you one more example on that is not related to Shabbat, because I face it all the time. When you mentioned before, people attack my opinions. Well, the attacks are all political. It's about you're right, it's about the policy. But the problem is that there's no proof and there's no argument that they are allowed to create that policy ignoring the needs of the people. So, example for that, I wrote an article about the kashrut of cheese, where I proved that clearly that you could eat any cheese in any in developed countries. All cheeses are kosher. All hard cheeses are kosher, whether they use animal rennet or vegetarian rennet or chemical rennet. Okay, so even if they use animal rennet, there are arguments that this is not a problem. It's a long story. So when the rabbi in my shul said he's going to give a class about kosher cheese, everybody turned looking at me and said, "Oh, we know what you said." So the rabbi noticed that. So he came to me and he says, actually, I heard a shiur from one of the Rashi Yeshiva of YU, discussing the issue of kosher cheese. And in his class, he mentioned you. And he said, "Oh, there's a rabbi in Maryland, Haim Ovadia, who says that you're allowed to eat all cheese. He probably relies on the opinion of Rabbeinu Tam. Well, we don't paskin like that." So this is the halachic argument. We don't paskin like that. That's not an argument. Say, we don't do this. Why don't you do this? Explain it to me. What is going to happen? And now I'm going to let's go to the text. But I will just say that because today we're barely going to touch electricity on Yom Tov, and we'll have to continue next Shabbat. I would just want to say that there are those who say, and one Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach is one of the leading poskim of the 20th century, said it and wrote it, that probably the usage of most electric devices on Shabbat is permitted. He wrote it very clearly. I mean, he debated the question for over 30 years, and he decided eventually to write it. So it's clearly written. Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says that the use of most electric devices is allowed on Shabbat. However, he's afraid that people are going to confuse one device with another, and they wouldn't know exactly what is allowed and what is not allowed, and therefore he'd rather remain silent on the subject and not say what is okay, what is not okay. Now, what is the result of that silence? What is the result of that silence? And that's something that we discuss in our Smicha classes. The result of the silence is that in people's mind, still the use of electricity on Shabbat is considered one of the gravest transgressions that one could do. And because of that, observant people, when faced with a situation where they have to use electricity on Shabbat to save a life, hesitate. And that hesitation cost many lives already. I would say, my estimate based on cases that I heard and know, in the hundreds. But even if it were one person, are the rabbis allowed to keep silent about a certain halacha and take upon themselves the responsibility, the possibility that someone will die because of that? Because if people knew the halacha, they would have acted differently, right? So let's look. I'm going to read with you. This is a short article that I wrote years ago about using electricity on Yom Tov. Oh, again, you see the lights are flickering here. Okay, you're lucky that we're not in the same room, because then when lightning strikes, it will only strike me, not you. It's fine. I don't know if it's transmittable by Zoom. So let's look at this article on Where is it? Here. Okay, so this is what I wrote. That was in 2016, and I wrote it in the format of a question and answer. So this is my answer. My question: is one allowed not to use electricity on Yom Tov? And I wrote it in that manner because I wanted to be positive, right? I wanted to say, to convey the message that using electricity on Yom Tov is so clearly allowed that for someone to say I'm not using it, it's in itself a transgression, because you allow yourself not to use electricity on Yom Tov. So apparently many observant people believe that it is permissible to avoid using electricity on Yom Tov. If one decides to avoid the use of electricity on Yom Tov, he is allowed, as long as it does not negatively affect the joy and happiness of the holiday. There are rabbis who oppose using electricity on Yom Tov, but their arguments are ideological rather than halachic. The ideological argument, something that we just mentioned, is understood and well respected, that we have to protect the spirit of Yom Tov. Now, here in this paragraph, I add that there was a reversal of the halachic ruling or the practice, up until the 50s in America and the 70s in Israel. Everybody used electricity on Yom Tov, at least among the Sfaradim, but then there was a campaign against it, probably because TV became ubiquitous and the rabbis were afraid that people are going to use it on the holiday. Here's my argument. The sad reality is that by defining something such as electricity as forbidden, while people intuitively understand that it is permissible, causes more harm. Because if we as rabbis and spiritual leaders, if we want to impose a ban on electric devices on Yom Tov, we should state that it is a fence and that according to halakha, it is allowed to use electricity on Yom Tov. Alternatively, rabbis should invest more education and in creating an exciting Shabbat and Yom Tov atmosphere. So I'll stop here. What I wanted to say here is that more and more people have access to knowledge. And when you deny people knowledge, and when you don't give them the credit of being able to understand and to handle the reality and their life, they lose trust in you. And I've warned about it in the past. It happened with the coronavirus, because there was a question whether you could do seder by Zoom or not. And here was a moment where the rabbis lost control, because they could issue their rulings, and there were, plenty of them, rulings saying you can, or you can. I'll share a link with David in a second, that you can or cannot use do a Zoom seder. But eventually, people did what they felt was correct. So and when people do that, they realize, what I did was right, and what my rabbi said was wrong. And this warning applies also to parenting. Parents tell children lies. If parents are able to be honest and own reality, then they will have a good relationship with their children. If they decide to work with lies, it's not going to work. A lot of the observant young people who go off the derech, it's called OTD, off the derech, they lose their way. To a lot of them, it happens because their parents lied to them about the outside world. They told them movies are horrible, TV is horrible, everything is trash. And then they all of a sudden one day, they watch a beautiful movie and they say, wow, my father is either stupid or he's a liar. So it doesn't happen that easily with rabbinic leadership, because unfortunately people have this tendency of being very very committed, and I think part of it is because they're invested. Unlike children who didn't invest but were forced into a certain state of mind, older people who invested their trust in a certain rabbi or in a certain movement find it very difficult to detach themselves from it, because they if they will say that the rabbi is wrong, they will say that they are wrong, but it causes deep conflicts for people. Let's go back to this article. I want to finish it, but and I wrote about this in my family. With all the years, with all the years that we did use electricity on Yom Tov, it never occurred to anyone in my family to use the radio or TV. So now, what are the halachic argument? The only halachic argument against electricity on Yom Tov, not on Shabbat. Right now we're talking about Yom Tov, which seems to have any validity, is that it is considered the molid, a rabbinic prohibition against creating a new object or entity. But as many rabbis have already proven, this argument does not apply to electricity, since flipping the switch only channels existing energy. And so molid is not about turning on the light. The rabbis who claim that it's molid, giving birth, claim that you're creating a new entity, but we know it's not. The energy, electrons are there. We're allowing the flow or the resistance to go through a certain conductor, and it's not molid. And here I quoted the widespread minhag was to use electricity on Yom Tov. And sorry? Is this a question or someone talking in the background? I can't tell. I'll mute everyone, and then if someone wants to ask, you could unmute yourselves. So here is the list of the rabbis who say that you could use electricity on Yom Tov, including Rabbi Yosef Mesas, Rabbi David Cohen Scali, Rabbi Zion Meir Uziel, the many who said that. Here I wrote this. The argument that is, some people argue that the rabbis who wrote at the turn of the 20th century did not understand the nature of electricity, and that you cannot say about Rabbi David Shlush or Rabbi Waldenberg. Both of them were not only very knowledgeable, but they sat with scientists and investigated the nature of electricity. And here, the Rav Shlush ruled in Hamda Ganuza. It says, "Sof davar nir'a lehatir adlakat hashmal biyom tov, v'norat hashmal u'shar machshira mutar lechabotam biyom tov." Not only you're allowed to turn on Yom Tov, you're allowed to turn off on Yom Tov as well. So I said this also. One who grew up not using electricity on Yom Tov is allowed to switch over, pun intended, for two reasons. One, the ruling against electricity stemmed from misunderstanding of its nature. And two, the decision of how to maintain the spirit of Yom Tov, at least in the private arena, is an individual one. So you could make the choice, you're not bound by that. And here are I can send it to you, you'll have the sources in Hebrew, but it's nice to read what Rav Meshash wrote. And here what is Rabbi Yosef Meshash wrote in Otzar HaMichtavim. It says, "Anu bnei Sefarad, נהגנו להתיר הדלקת חשמל ביום טוב שלא כדעת אחינו האשכנזים." Says the minhag among the Sephardic Jews is to use electricity on Yom Tov, not like the opinion of the Ashkenazim. Even though there are some Ashkenazi rabbis who say it's mutar, but Rabbi Yosef Meshash is referring to the widespread minhag. Why is that? כיוון שאין בדבר זה שום איסור נולד כלל. The idea of nolad, of producing something new, doesn't apply to that. וכאן בארץ ישראל טוענים שנהגו לאסור וזו התחייה בעלמא. He says now that he came to Eretz Israel, he came in I think 1969, he came to Israel. People argued that there was a minhag to forbid. It says zot hiya be'alma. There's no real basis for that there is an existing minhag. אכן מדינה מותר להדליק ולכבות חשמל ביום טוב. You're allowed to turn on and off חשמל, the electricity on יום טוב. והישרים מודים על האמת. It says you're honest, you say the truth. ואם יש בזה ספק, if you have any doubt whether you can or not, הרי שרות דרבנן, it's a rabbinical issue that is cast in doubt, and you go with the leniency. And it says, שמחת יום טוב היא מצווה מן התורה, you have to rejoice on יום טוב, ואין לך שמחה כאור החשמל. Remember the question that I raised in the beginning, what do we do without electricity? It says, if you don't have electricity, and then finally it comes, how happy you are. And he adds also in his Shut Maim Haim, אם תאסור לו לכבותו, יימנע מלהדליקו. Some people have the minhag to only turn on, but not off. But if you do that, they will even not turn it on because they don't want to leave it on the whole day. And if that happens, it says, לא לבד שיתבטל משמחת יום טוב, אלא ישב בעוגמת נפש מהיעדרו. וזה מהווה זלזול גדול ליום טוב שמגרע אותו משאר לילות. says not only you're going to avoid Simchat Yom Tov, to avoid doing something joyous, you are going to even be sad or depressed because you're not using it. So it's not only the loss of Simcha, but an active addition of sorrow. And it says, "Ze me'aveh zilzul gadol Yom Tov." It says that makes Yom Tov lesser than the rest of the week. Because the rest of the week, you say you have light, you could turn AC, you could adjust it, you could make yourself a cup of coffee, and you can do it on Yom Tov. It says, and don't try to tell me that you should call a non-Jew to do it. So bottom line, and there are many other sources regarding Yom Tov, there's no reason to say that it is forbidden. The spirit of Yom Tov should be in the control, in the hands of the people. If it's about a halachic argument, there is none. So now what we have left to see, and obviously the article I wrote about this is longer. I could share it. I'll share it with the WhatsApp group, so you could review it before next week. We'll have to see how the use of electricity, how it ties into the Lametet Melachot of Shabbat. So now